This morning I want to talk about experiential, or the experience of Christianity. Experience over knowledge. And I want to address a few issues this morning. And we're going to look at Matthew 15:10. As you know, this COVID thing has been kind of interesting. Spent a lot of time talking with people over this last week. There's been a couple experiences that our families personally had. I would say 2 weeks ago, I think I knew one person that had COVID, and it seemed like they went through it fine, no problems. That was my understanding, anyways. And as the weeks poured on, we began to experience it coming closer and closer to our own home. As you know, Pastor Tom Philippi contracted it. He ended up going to the ER. He was in very desperate measures that I was afraid we were going to lose him there for a bit. I was very concerned. And it's not only him, many other families that we know personally from our mother church. This thing blew through our mother church like a hurricane. I don't even know how many people. I can't even begin to count, because as I think I know how many people, I find out there's another couple that had it as well. We have another friend of ours. As far as I know, she's still in the hospital on oxygen. My son contracted it. My oldest son. That's why we were in quarantine for this last week. So it kind of bared down on us really quick. It's like you hear about the COVID cases out there, and you're wondering, is it falsified information? Is it, who do you believe? Can you get good data? Is this good data? Is it bad data? And if you've talked to me about it, you know that I'm very skeptical about the data. I'm very skeptical about anything that's the official storyline, I think. But as this thing started bearing down, you realize, okay, this is a real thing. This is something that's contracted very, very easily and is spread very, very easily. And so that's a kind of a sobering experience. Me and my wife went and got tested because like I said, our oldest son had it, and I was with him. Me and my boys were with him on the 13th of June. And so that falls within the guidelines of isolation, quarantine, I believe they call it. So as this thing starts to get more widespread, I think there'll be more cases of quarantine and more cases of having to go through these extreme measures. So, and that changed my outlook a little bit as far as being able to experience that instead of it being just a story on the news. Even when this COVID thing broke out, it was like, what's happening in Asia? And it's like, well, of course, this stuff always happens in Asia. You don't see that stuff here. And I was talking to one of our brothers yesterday, and we're saying that the only time I could think that a generation had to ever deal with this thing was our grandparents. The Depression era, the things that they had to endure, the Spanish flu, and then the Depression, 2 world wars. There's a lot going on during that time. There hasn't really been that much activity since then, I don't think so. These aren't unprecedented times, but they're definitely, for us, something new to experience. So we're going to read from Matthew 15:10, starting out here. And he says, "And he called the people to him and said to him, 'Hear and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person.' Then the disciples came and said to him, 'Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?' He answered, 'Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone, they are blind guides. And in the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit.' And Peter said to him, 'Explain to us this parable.' And he said, 'Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But when it comes out of the mouth and proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person, for out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat what is unwashed hands does not defile anyone.' So the power of words is very interesting. The words can build up and they can also tear down. We speak out of our mouths can build up or they can tear down. And this can greatly affect our relationships with our friends. You say a crossword with a friend, and that can alter that relationship. Say a crossword or say something accusatory toward your spouse, that can alter that relationship. So words are very important. And James makes this statement. James 3:11 and 12 says, "Does a spring pour forth the same opening, both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can salt pond yield fresh water." It's talking about the mouth. How can out of our own hearts, that heart that we have, how can it produce both good and evil? How can it produce both good and evil? So maybe it comes down to controlling nature, controlling our nature. And I've heard this said that I'm an unfiltered person. You ever heard somebody say that? I'm an unfiltered person. I don't have a filter. I broke my filter. I left my filter at home. Or my wife is my filter. I've said that. All right. Dave, don't say that. And sometimes that has two different meanings. Just saying that I don't have a filter can have two different meanings. And the two different meanings are, one of them is an excuse not to control our tongue. It can be used as an excuse. You just say whatever comes to your mind. Some people would call that diarrhea of the mouth. Right? It can be very ugly. Oh, I just feel this way, so I say what I want to, because I'm pure. It's like a badge of purity. I say whatever comes. It's like, no, your heart's evil. Like, I have things that come to my mind too, and if I said them, somebody would probably shoot me, right? Somebody cuts you off in traffic, first thing you want to do is run by them and say a bunch of crazy stuff to them, right? Or somebody punches you and you want to say something, or somebody even looks at you cross. What are you, eyeballs stuck, son? Right? Right? There's things that you want to say that maybe you should just keep your mouth shut, save you a little bit of trouble. So diarrhea of the mouth. I like this quote. It's kind of taken from the biblical quote, but it's got a little bit of a twist to it because it's not from the Bible, but I like it. It says, "Better to remain silent and be thought of as a fool than to speak and remove all doubt." I don't know if Mark Twain said that or Abraham Lincoln. There's different spins on that. It's better to be thought of as a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Sounds like Mark Twain. And that's true. I mean, that excuse of I'm a non-filtered person. I mean, when you're a non-filtered person and you speak in such a manner, you can be, it's like, okay, wow. It's like that's not a very leveled approach to life. And Proverbs tells us that in Proverbs 18:20 through 21, "From the fruit of a man's mouth his stomach is satisfied. He is satisfied by the yield of his lips. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat of its fruits." Death and life are in the power of the tongue. That's pretty powerful for this little thing to have such impact. It's got more impact than your arms, more impact than your legs. Your tongue can form the world around you. And the other part of being non-filtered is constructive truth-telling. Being constructive. James 3:4-5 says, "Look at the ships also. Though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder. Wherever the wind Of the pilot directs, also the tongue is a smaller member, yet it boasts of great things. Constructive truth, being able to speak truth regardless of the consequences, not masking it and playing politician, right? This is the other part of what I call the constructive part of being non-filtered. Like there's a non-filtered if I just say whatever I want and whatever comes to mind I say it, and it can be very destructive and very, very good in a way, but it's just like you got salt water and fresh water coming out of the same spring, and it gets really kind of ugly. And then there's the part where I'm just going to hold my tongue and not say necessarily what I think, but be constructive and say things that are truthful and that are positive and will add to the situation. You ever been around somebody that just complains and never fixes anything? It's frustrating. If you've ever been on a job and you've been working with somebody that just complains and complains and complains, but yet you never see them lifting a finger to fix the problem. Or they say, well, it's beyond my scope. They have to do it. It's like, well, what can you do to influence it? You know, it's like if you can't fix it or you have no part in the fixing, then maybe you should worry about fixing what's around you, right? I started reading a book this week, and I just started. I'm a couple chapters in. It's an old classic that I've never read, and so I was talking to my mom about some history stuff. We were talking about my grandparents, and she started talking about a book that she said she couldn't read, and I was like, well, that perked my ears up. She says I can't read it; it's too much for me to read, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I perked my ears up, and I guess her mom said that my mom said that one time she stayed up all night reading this book, and she said, yes, this is how it was, and it's called The Grapes of Wrath. I don't know if anybody's ever read that book. I've never read it. I think my oldest kids had to read it as a reading assignment. That's why it's on my bookshelf. And so I went over there and I says, Mom, I think I got that book. I remember I've heard about it plenty of times, and so I went and I started reading it. And I know a little bit about the Dust Bowl from stories from my grandparents and from documentaries and reading about the time period. But it's different to read about it than it is to experience. For my grandmother, it was a real experience. She grew up in Oklahoma, and she was around during that time, and it was a very interesting time for sure. But there's something in there that I think my grandparents possessed this trait. Thinking about it, I did a lot of thinking about it after I read this chapter, or I read this portion out of this book, and I believe they exemplified this type of behavior, and I thought it was very interesting because it's something that's not very common, especially in today's world. But here in the story of in the Grapes of Wrath is the very first chapter, I believe it was. Yeah, it's the very first chapter. It's talking about when the dust had just covered everything, the crops are going to die. It's just bleak. I mean, it's bleak. If you've ever seen, there's a documentary, I believe, on Amazon Prime about the Dust Bowl. It's very, very good. That was kind of an eye-opening experience, being able to see the pictures and the interviews with the people that lived through it. It's interesting. But here it is. It says, after, like the day after this, all the crops are just completely ruined. The story picks up here. I'm going to read part of this story here. It says, the people came out of their houses, and smelled the hot, stinging air, and covered their noses from it. And the children came out of the houses, but they did not run or shout as they would have done after a rain. Men stood by their fences and looked at the ruined corn, drying fast now. Only a little green was showing through the film of dust. The men were silent, and they did not move often. And the women came out of the houses to stand beside their men, to feel whether this time the men would break. The women studied the men's faces secretly, for the corn could go, as long as something else remained. The children stood nearby, drawing figures in the dust with bare toes, and the children sent exploring senses out to see whether men and women would break. The children peeked at the faces of the men and women, and then drew careful lines in the dust with their toes. Horses came to the watering troughs and nuzzled the water to clear the surface dust. After a while, the faces of the watching men lost their bemused perplexity and became hard and angry and resistant. Then the women knew that they were safe and that there was no break. Then they asked, "What will we do?" And the men replied, "I don't know." But it was all right. The women knew it was all right. And the watching children knew it was all right. Women and children knew deep in within themselves that no misfortune was too great to bear if their men were whole. The women went into the houses to their work, and the children began to play, but cautiously at first. As the day went forward, the sun became less red. It flared down on the dust-blanketed land. The men sat in the doorways of their houses. Their hands were busy with sticks and little rocks. The men sat still, thinking and figuring. This is pretty powerful. That here it is, the man steps out of his home and he sees everything he's put his hands to. I mean, think about it. If you know anything about the Dust Bowl and this part of Oklahoma where these people moved to, they left everything, sold everything, moved their families into this part of Oklahoma, Texas area. And they began to farm for the hopes of that, we're gonna be able to support our family, be able to make something out of this American dream. They were sold a lie. Wherever you farm, the rain comes, I believe was the lie back then. There was no rain in that area, very little rain. And so they began to tear up the ground with this thought that this misinformation of these people selling them these land tracts saying, hey, rain follows the farm. And so they went out and they did farming. And then all this stuff started happening due to bad farming practices, not enough rain. There was a lot of issues at stake here. But these families were held together by the fact that they were watching one person. They had their eyes fixed on one person, and that was the head of the household, the man of the house. As you can see, everybody comes out, from the wife to the children to even the animals. They're all watching. And if this man keeps this stuff together and doesn't freak out, start throwing stuff and cussing out the wind and start breaking things, because once that happens, they know it's over. They know it's over. And that's one thing I picked up in these interviews, is like you see how calm they were. I mean, people lost their lives because of the amount of dust, because of lung diseases and different things. People lost their eyes. I mean, it was bad. I mean, could you imagine going out to set a table and then putting a glass down, you have to put it upside down, because if you put it upside right, by the time you put something in it, it's going to have dirt in it. I mean, that's what kind of life this is. It's dirty. And here they are, they come out, and their whole lives are dependent, looking on this one person, not to lose it and say something absolutely crazy and break like you see happening all around us in our world today. Keeping your tongue and not saying what's come to mind. I'm sure the men during this time are like, you know what, forget this. Let's just go throw ourselves in the river. Or at this point, seems very bleak, and they're about ready to lose everything. But everybody was waiting on him. And they did, see, the thing is the family, even if it says in the story, it says they didn't care how hard it was. They just wanted to know that he was okay. That whoever it was, the head of the household, was okay. If they were whole, then it didn't matter how hard it was, how difficult it was, how much they starved, how much things got bad, or what conditions were there. As long as they're whole, everything's all right. That's amazing. Not, am I getting 3 square meals a day? Did I lose my internet connection? Right? Did somebody say something cross to me? I mean, think about the amount of character this takes to be able to endure this and not be concerned about all the stuff that people flip out over today. Think about all the stuff that we flip out over, and then think about living like this. There's a level here, right? So why is this important about not freaking out and speaking too quickly? I got a kind of a lesson in this when my daughter she was probably under a year old. She was in a car seat. My wife probably remember this, but we were on our way to the airport, and I don't remember if it was a time we didn't take our tickets with us, but I remember we were stressing out. I mean, we were stressing out. I was very young. I was like 23, 24, and we had a baby, and we're trying to get to the airport, and this was before cell phones. We didn't have a cell phone. We didn't have any of that stuff, and no internet. You know what I mean? So not on a phone, anyways, or I guess there was internet, but you had to log into a beast to get it. It's like, yeah, there was dial-up. So it's like 1998. So there is some things, but we didn't have a lot of things. We didn't have a lot of money, and I remember being on our way to the airport and being stressed out so much. And we're talking and we're just stressing out trying to get to the airport, rush hour traffic. Don't have our tickets. How are we going to get our tickets? And I remember my daughter was in the back seat. She's a baby. It's not like she understands what we're talking about, but she picks up on the stress. It's weird. Kids pick up on this. She picks up on the stress, and she ended up throwing up. And I was like, and I realized that she threw up because of the stress. Because she's still in the car seat. She's not even a year old, and she's throwing up. And I was like, wow, it's kind of crazy how contagious that is. And so there's been times in our lives when things have been very bleak, and I know that if we don't talk to them about it, as far as in hurried sentences like the world's falling apart, maybe have a discussion with our kids about what's going on. But show us some strength, showing that, hey, we're believing God, or we're going to persevere. You have something positive to say. The kids will feel secure. They feel secure. Family feels secure. There is a difference. There's a tangible difference. And we're reading in this book. It just something that resonated with me, and thinking about. I remember obviously my grandparents went through a lot, but I remember my grandpa. He had this old pickup truck, and he was, it was one of those old early like 60s models Fords with a 3 on the tree, and he was trying to start it, and the thing didn't want to start. And as a kid, I'm sitting there. I was sitting on the side. My grandma was sitting in the middle, and my grandpa was obviously driving. It was this single cab pickup truck, and I could tell he was getting frustrated. And I remember my grandma just laying her hand on his back, like, "It's all right, Arthur. It's okay." And I was just like, as a kid, I'm like, why is she saying that? But I didn't realize, now that I know how frustrated he probably was. And I'm thinking to myself, hey, I'm going to tell my grandparents. It means we're going to Dairy Dan. I'm going to get a chocolate vanilla twist. I'm thinking ice cream cone. Here we go, right? You notice my life revolves around ice cream a lot. But it was a very, they helped each other a lot in that regard. But I don't remember I can't think of a time when I remember my mother's parents freaking out. And this book, I think, they lived in that area. They went through these things. I think I told you stories about my grandpa before, but anyways. So how do we get to that point? How do we become like that's something to think about, like becoming a person of being calm in the midst of chaos. How do we gain control over our flesh and be able to get to that point in our own lives? And this is where the experience comes in. You can't learn this from a book. This is the problem. I mean, if you could learn this from a book and I could just get a booklet and just hand it out to every disciple, every person I come across, man, wouldn't the world be better off if you could just absorb the information through the Logos, through the Word? But it comes through experience. And you have to stretch yourself sometimes. Get outside of your own comfort zone. It comes through discipline. And as you probably know, this conference is coming up. We've been talking about conference. And as you know, the conference is coming up. And before the conference comes, we always have a time of fasting and prayer. And that is actually starting tomorrow. As I've been announcing, it starts tomorrow. Caleb's eyes are big. He's like, no. And that's going to be for the next 3 days. But it takes stretching ourselves, confronting our own flesh. It takes discipline to bring those wild notions into subjection so we can control them. You know, a lot of times people have diarrhea of the mouth because they literally can't control it. When they say, I'm an unfiltered person, they can't control it because they're... And I've been that person. Trust me. It's like it's burning on your tongue. Something in you just wants to speak things that are negative or perverse even. And you have to bring that under control. And fasting and prayer will bring your life under control. There's a thing about fasting that's more than just going without food. If you've ever been grieved, it's hard to eat. If you've ever been deeply sorrow, like have deep sorrow, like somebody close to you dies or something happened, maybe your own self, you did something that was really, really bad and you're grieved within yourself that you could do such a dastardly thing that it's like you can't feed yourself. It's like you're almost going almost like a self-destruct mode almost, but you can't. You're just so grieved that, I mean, when we're happy, we eat like crazy, don't we? I mean, it's always a good sign when somebody's healthy, they want to eat, right? That was one good things that Tom was in the hospital. He's having a hard time eating. He just didn't have an appetite. When you're sick, you don't have an appetite. And when he called and told me that, hey, I think I got my appetite back, he was sending me a picture. They actually served steak, and it wasn't a very good looking steak. It was kind of thin. It wasn't like the ones we had on the camp out. But, right? But it was, he sent me steak and asparagus and mashed potatoes. And he's like, yeah, I think I'm feeling better. I'm starting to eat more. And I was like, oh, good. That's a good sign. If you're eating, that's good. That means your body's happy. So fasting comes through a time of even mourning. And do we not have something to mourn about, in a sense? Do we not mourn about what's happening in the world around us, in our culture around us, and what's happening within our nation? Are we being bamboozled into things? Are we, what's happening to our rights? What's happening to our church? I mean, it really grieves me that the fact I can't function as I normally would, that it's very difficult for me to follow up on new converts. It's very difficult for me to have fellowship with people within the church. That grieves me because that's where my heart's at. That's why I'm a pastor, because I want to be able to do those things. I want to bring people together and minister to them and have them, have Christ touch their lives. And it grieves me to not be able to function in a certain way that allows me to have that expression. I miss having dinner parties with my friends. I miss being around my family. I want to go see my parents, but I can't, right? There's things that grieve me deeply because of the circumstances that are beyond my control. So we have a reason to have grief, to have sorrow, to want things to change things. I got this letter from one of our brothers. This comes from Pastor Greg Mitchell. This is actually a real letter, not one I wrote. And what's the funny thing is, remember I read that letter saying from Pastor Mitchell as a make-believe letter? I actually did get a letter from Pastor Mitchell. And my wife says, hey, that's a letter. I'm like, oh my God. I was like, I hope it's better than the one I wrote for myself. So, no, it was an invitation to conference. But so because of everything that's going on, not with the riots and stuff, but with the COVID stuff. Like I said, this blew through our mother church. This has gone through other churches that they've had to deal with this. And this is a pretty big deal because our fellowship's been having these conferences for 50 years. This conference is 50 years. Think about that. 50 years. That's half a century. That's pretty amazing. Of having conferences, bringing churches together, preaching, teaching, fellowship, sending churches out. That's how we got launched out. That's why we're here, is because of a conference. And that's been going on for 50 years. Sending churches into the nations all around the world. But because of the current health crisis, it has changed even our conference. And I'm a little bit grieved that it has changed. I mean, I'll read you the letter. It says, "Dear Pastor," this is addressed to pastors, and it says, "In our rapid changing world, we are constantly assessing the way to ensure the health and safety of everyone while still being able to have conference. We have come to the difficult conclusion that no children under 13 will be allowed to attend the conferences." That's a pretty big deal. The logic behind this is twofold. One, we are discovering in the Prescott Church and other fellowship churches that COVID cases, that children are getting infected, but are almost always asymptomatic. Two, as children are the hardest to keep tabs on and least likely to take wise precautions, it is best not to have them at the conference. This protects them from contracting the virus and protects others from contracting it from them. This also applies to people who have made their own accommodation arrangements. Also, there may be people who are intending on attending conference but have various health issues, have put them at greater risk. I want you to seriously consider whether it is wise to come. I have had some that have real concerns and health issues, but are concerned they may be viewed unfavorably for not supporting the conference. I assure you that this is not the case. I have no problem with people choosing not to attend, and even prefer it in some cases. Thank God everyone can still participate in conference via live stream. That's good, right? These are absolutely unprecedented times that we have never experienced. I never imagined a scenario in my life when I would discourage people from attending a conference. But God is on the throne. Life is based on seasons, and this season of sickness will pass. I apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. I appreciate your understanding and covet your prayers. As I make decisions, I ask that you get any changes or cancellations in as soon as possible. Yours for revival, Pastor Greg Mitchell. That's from our fellowship. This letter grieves me. I don't know if it grieves you or not, but it grieves me that my pastor has to write this message, right? Because conference for us is a very big deal. As a fellowship, fulfilling the whole push of our fellowship is to go ye into the world, make disciples of all people. Preach the gospel and make disciples. That is the push for our fellowship. And the fact that this is being truncated, or feels like it's being truncated, that our mission, our goal is being truncated because of a virus is very frustrating. Very frustrating for me, and I'm sure very frustrating for Pastor Greg. But like he says, the Bible talks about their seasons in life. There's a time to plant, and there's a time to reap. There's a time to embrace, there's a time to refrain from embracing. There's a time to gather stones together, and there's a time to disperse stones away. Right? Ecclesiastes gives us this example. There's a time and a season for things, and this is the season for whatever it is God wants to do. I think it's a great time. There's many things that need to be addressed. There's many things to be in prayer about, many things to be fasting about. Not only with relations amongst people seem to be at an all-time low, unfortunately, but that's a great opportunity for God to move. It is. There's darkness out there, and a little bit of light can make a huge difference. This is a grand opportunity for God to move, and I believe that if we're looking at it from just a negative standpoint, but we got to look at it from the potential standpoint. That there's a major potential for God to move. Any movement of God that's happened in the past has always come out of some type of crazy upheaval within the people around it. Jesus people movement came out of the hippie movement, right? You had all these hippies, they're crazy, they're It's unrestrained. And what do those people do? They found out that that was not satisfactory. Their life was not satisfactory. There was something very dissatisfied about an unrestrained life. And a lot of them came to Christ because of it, because they were looking for something more. So we see that in our world today. This is a good time. It's a good time to be alive. It's a good time to be functioning. Who knows what God will do? But we have things to fast and pray about. We need to prepare ourselves in every way possible. Let's go ahead and bow our heads and close our eyes this morning. We talked about fasting and praying this morning, but first I just want to address, do you know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? I know everybody in this room, but I just want to give an opportunity like we always do. If you want to give your life to Jesus this morning, you're backslidden, you want to signify that with an uplifted hand, say, that's me. Anybody at all. Praise God. So this morning, like I said, we're going to have a time fasting and prayer. We're going to be starting tomorrow morning. And we fast day and night until Wednesday evening, after the Wednesday evening service. Then we'll break fast. There's a lot of things to pray about. I encourage all of you to join with me in this time. It's not a time to be standing on the sidelines. This is a time to be engaged. Engaged in what God's doing. There's lots of things to pray about. The conference coming up and everything else. I want to pray for my pastor. My pastor, his pastor. Like I said, when we pray for our headship, spiritually and our secular leadership, this is a time to definitely be praying for those people to make wise decisions, because there's a lot of stuff going on that will have an effect on us. And we need to pray for them to have the clear-mindedness on what the Spirit of God is doing. And they need our prayers. Like I need your prayers. I'm trying to figure this out every day, so let's join together. If God's dealing with you this morning, I'm going to open up these altars. I'll sing a song. If you want to make it. Oh, awesome is the sight of your holiness. Majestic is your purity. Your righteousness, it shines brighter than the sun on me. And holy, holy, holy is the Lord our God. Glory, glory, glory to his matchless name. Worthy, worthy, worthy is the Lamb that was slain, that was slain, that was slain. Awesome is the sight of your holiness. Majestic is your purity. Your righteousness shines brighter than the sun on me. And holy, holy, holy is the Lord our God. Glory, glory, glory to his matchless name. Worthy, worthy, worthy is the Lamb that was slain, that was slain, that was slain. Caleb, you want to dismiss us in prayer?
Father, we thank you, Lord, for this message that you've given us. We ask that you would be with us, Lord. Protect us, Lord God, as we go from the service. We ask that you would take us home safely and bring us back to the next service. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.